Good morning. How's everybody doing today? Oh, come on, let's do it again. How's everybody doing today? That's more like it. That's more like it. Well, welcome to our ERISA at 40 retrospective, introspective, prospective. There's got to be another spective in there somewhere, right? You all work with me on it. First off, good morning. I'm, again, as I said, Nevin Adams, Chief of Communications here at ASPA. You know, 1974 is the year that most Americans, probably to the extent we remember it, we look back and we think about it being the year that Richard Nixon was forced to resign because of Watergate, right? Right. But there was a lot more going on in 1974 than that. We also had, it was the year that Arthur Fry, who's ever heard of Arthur Fry? Anybody? Anybody? No. He invented the Post-it note in 1974. It was also the year in which 21-year-old Michael Kittredge opened his Yankee Candle factory. And, as George Bush Sr. would one day come to regret, was also the year that the first UPC scanner was installed at a Marsh's supermarket in Troy, Ohio. Who's from Ohio? There you go. Now, on a less notable note, it was also the year in which liposuction was invented. I'm not going to ask how many of you know that from an up-close and personal perspective. But more importantly, 1974, of course, was the year in which ERISA was enacted. It took a mere, dozen years after the failure of Studebaker that triggered everything and set it in motion. In fact, it was those problems at that automaker. At one time, not everybody was in Detroit. That was in great old South Bend, Indiana. These days, we think of it for other reasons, don't we? But it was put in mind to provide the impetus to protect the funds that were invested in those plans for the benefit of participants and those beneficiaries, to provide a set of federal standards. As President Ford said at the time, quote, "It is essential to bring some order and humanity into this welter of different and sometimes inequitable retirement plans within private industry." So we're here today. We're thrilled to have with us a panel of industry luminaries. Is that a fair statement? To talk about what ERISA was designed to do, what it's wrought, and what's looking ahead. So please join me in welcoming to my right, Mark Iwry, Dallas Salisbury, Al Lurie, Ann Combs, Harry Conaway, and this guy on the end, I'm not sure who he is, but he's here too. Welcome. All right, we're going to start off with an easy question, folks. Well, easy for some. So where were you in 1974, and what were you doing? Mark?
Nevin, we were working on the cash balance regs. I could say that I was listening to Harry Conaway say that the 401k regs will be out this fall. Soon.
Yeah, soon.
I was actually, like you, in school. Had no idea, no concept that I'd ever end up doing something relating to ERISA or pensions or employee benefits. I was working for, doing research for a professor, a terrific guy named Richard Neustadt, who wrote Presidential Power. Some of you are of an age to remember that or to have read it in college. He advised JFK, he advised LBJ and others, and I was his summer research assistant. So we were writing a case study on Anglo-French and American relations having to do with decision-making in public policy.
Well, that was a lot better than what I was doing.
Wow.
Dallas?
I moved to Washington, D.C. in May of that year and went to work at the Justice Department. And the first meeting I attended in the conference room of the Deputy Attorney General was a negotiation with the then Solicitor of Labor, Bill Kilberg, over who would have litigation, should have litigation authority, civil and criminal, in this thing that was on Capitol Hill being negotiated called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And so I was in Washington, and my introduction to ERISA was before it had become law.
Al?
I was a practicing lawyer, and a tax lawyer, actually. Pensions were sort of a sideline. I got involved in them somewhat. I used to go out occasionally to Phoenix with Barry and Eaton. Some of you may remember the name Barry and Eaton. At the Alliaba program in Phoenix. And we got a copy of the latest version of ERISA, which was frightening, terrifying, as I was about to get up and make a talk as a private practitioner. And I looked at this, I thumbed through it, and I said, boy, this is my swan song. I used to have fun in this area, but this isn't going to be fun. This statute looks awful. Not only that, the idea of labor and the IRS in bed together, which I thought was an obscene act. It turned out to be worse than obscene. But the fact of the matter is, I literally said this is my swan song and believed that was the case. 4 months later, I was the first statutory assistant commissioner of Internal Revenue, drafted, frankly, for the job. Had not planned I was going to go to Washington. Wasn't sure I wanted to serve in the Nixon administration. As you may recall, he was still the president. There was a close conjunction between Nixon's presidency and ERISA as it happened. In fact, there was a direct motivation because of the potential impeachment, which was then gaining fervor. The leadership in the Congress, House and Senate, advised their committees, if you want to get anything done with ERISA, this is the time, because once we start the impeachment proceedings, there'll be no more work until we conclude them. And that created the motivation, the stimulus for ERISA to finally get enacted, which of course happened in immediate conjunction with Nixon's resignation. It was expected he would sign it. He decided to take a pill and left, waving to his many fans, or less than many. So that's where I was.
Wow. Ann?
I can't top that. I was graduated from high school in 1974, and retirement policy was probably the last thing on my mind, but I also headed off to South Bend, Indiana to go to college, so maybe it was inevitable that I would end up in this field. I don't know, but I was not thinking about retirement policy. I don't think I really focused on the signing of ERISA. It was more like graduation, parties, homecoming, college.
Yeah, beer.
Maybe.
Harry, do you remember where you were in 1974?
Yeah, I just graduated college in '74, and I was beginning a master's program in anthropology, studying Hinduism and Buddhism, anthropology at Penn, and you can all see how that leads directly into ERISA. It was.
Well, it explains a lot about 401ks, but no.
That's right. The one thing I remember from that period about ERISA before I got into the field more formally was my father ran a law firm in Wilmington, Delaware, and I remember him telling me how there was this new horrible law, and he couldn't get any lawyers, couldn't find anybody to work on it, to write these damn plans. And they were making special outreach efforts to try to bring in lawyers and paralegals to try to understand it and sort of start working on ERISA. So
He was probably a contemporary of Connie Murdoch. You remember Connie?
Yeah, I remember the name.
Connie was one of the early leaders in the pension area, and he operated in Wilmington.
Really? Okay.
And this was well before ERISA. What you people don't realize, the pension business did not start with ERISA. ERISA was a late comer. I mean, we had a long history of pensions in this country. In fact, they go back to 1875, but that's a different story.
That's the lunch session, right?
Well, all right.
You don't want to know what I was doing?
I'm afraid to know what you were doing. Yes, what were you doing,
Early
Brian?
financial planning for my fellow sixth graders.
I hadn't realized how old I was.
It's been a long time since I've been, until you spoke. I was reveling in being the youngest one in the family.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, that's the way it works sometimes. You know, it's interesting.
Wait, just a second. Al, you mentioned 1875.
Yeah.
Do you want to sort of tell us what you were doing during the early period?
Absolutely. In 1875, I can't remember where I was. I don't think. But what was happening in 1875, in point of fact, was the first pension plan in America. According to historians, I don't know that that's been proved, but the general consensus is that you're probably all carrying in your pockets or purses a plastic box that memorializes the founder of the sponsor of the first pension plan, American Express, 1875.
Wow. All right.
Yeah, it's on the Iwry website. It must be right.
That's right.
But I wasn't really there.
Yeah.
Well, you know, let's talk about it. Everybody's got this sort of undertow here that says, my God, we looked at ERISA and it was an awful law and it's a terrible thing and there's all these bad things. But there was an environment that sort of set this up and sort of called for this need. And yeah, Studebaker ends up being sort of the poster child for it. But let's talk a little bit about what the environment was like before we had ERISA. I mean, why did it matter? Why do we have this law that everybody was so intimidated by?
Well, it mattered primarily because Jacob Javits took it as a cause. His labor counsel, as you probably know, some of you may know, is Frank Cummings. And Frank really fed Javits into this area, and he drafted the first bill that Javits signed. Javits was the first and principal mover towards pension reform legislation. I mean, there were a lot of steps along the way, and at some point, if you're interested, I can take you through some of those steps. But the point is, it was a very active area. I mean, pensions weren't waiting for ERISA. In fact, they probably would have shied away from it if they knew it was coming.
Okay, you hear a lot of talk, particularly these days, that you know, ERISA's 40 years old. It's been out there a while. It was designed for a different time. You know, we have a different dynamic today. We have different demographics today. Didn't really contemplate a DC world. It was really kind of a DB world. What do you all think? Did ERISA miss it? Did it do it about right? How's ERISA held up? Ann?
I think it's held up very well. Now, I come out of the labor side, not the tax side, and I think that the structure of ERISA has really served us well and held up very well. The basic prudence, fiduciary, assets being held in trust with a named fiduciary, having to operate prudently, solely in the interest. I think the plan asset reg, the flexibility of the investments that plans are allowed to do has allowed it to evolve and adapt to new plan structures, to new investment products, to new services. And so I think in that sense it's held up very well. I think they were wise to both in the statute and then in the initial regulations that Ian Lanoff, who was at the Labor Department, did with the plan asset reg and the prudence regulation to basically kind of adopt what was then rather new, the modern portfolio theory, that you could actually invest in riskier assets as long as it was diversified and it was balanced, was really quite forward-looking, I think. And so from that perspective, I think that part of ERISA has held up extraordinarily well. That would be my...
As a footnote, Nevin, the modern portfolio theory approach and so forth, Ann has never gotten proper credit, I think, for developing those QDIA regulations, you know, the Qualified Default Investment Alternative regulations that really were a significant step as part of moving our 401k system into a more automatic enrollment, automatic investment, other automatic escalation of contributions, you know, other features designed to make the 401k more effective. And one of the key steps was to create default investments, or a safe place for default investments that employers could choose without undue concern about fiduciary liability, that were asset allocated, right? That reflected modern portfolio theory, like the target date life cycle funds or the balanced funds or the managed accounts that became the initial QDIAs. And a lot of people credit that to the 2006 Pension Protection Act. But PPA actually, while it required labor to do it, Anne, as Assistant Secretary at the time, had already proposed those regs and anticipated that. So a lot actually has been done by administrative action as opposed to just legislation, and that's a great example.
Thank you.
Point.
Nevin, I guess I would answer your question. I agree with Ann. The federal framework around the issues that ERISA did address, I think, was a very positive part of what came with the new law. I think also that it's easy to look now and see what's worked or what we think has worked and maybe what hasn't worked, and it's okay to do that analysis, to look at outcomes and effects. But I think if we were to transport ourselves back to 1974, I think we'd probably feel that we'd done a pretty good job addressing the major issues, the major problems that we had seen at that point. So I think it's sort of like ERISA itself, that you should evaluate the job that was done based on the time and the context when it was done and what was known then, and not by looking at the future outcomes, the future results. I think we should do that as well to identify sort of changes, but you know, I think it was a job well done. It would be my view.
Can I just interject, Al, 1 second? Just follow up on what he said, if you don't mind. The multi-jurisdictional issue, you mentioned it before, you just mentioned it. That was kind of revolutionary at the time. I know this may be difficult for some of you to answer, but was it ideal? In fact, today, the SEC is now getting involved. There's some talk about getting the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau involved. We could have FINRAs involved. I mean, the number of agencies getting involved in the retirement world is growing because of the precedent of having more than one agency involved in a law. What's your reaction to that precedent?
Well, you know, dual jurisdiction was not a contrived action. It wasn't planned. In fact, Javits' first bill provided for a single regulatory agency, which was labor. I mean, ERISA started, the momentum for ERISA was labor. It was not the tax side.
And I forgot the PBGC, by the way.
The regulation of the pension law was tax. Labor's role in the actual regulation was minimal. And in fact, initially, the labor committees, House and Senate, were running with that statute. And at some point, when Javits and Williams joined forces, a Democrat and a Republican, in the Senate Labor Committee, they were able to get the Labor Committee to approve that draft, that William Javits bill. But the fact of the matter is that was the spur, all of a sudden, for the Senate Finance Committee. They realized this statute is running away from them. And hey, we thought we were the regulators of pensions. What's this Johnny-come-lately? What do they do? And that motivated the Senate Finance Committee to get in the act. And that was late in the game. It was about 1972 that I think the Senate Finance Committee produced its first version. And from 72 to 74, it was a turf battle. The House committees and the Senate committees of labor and the House and Senate tax committees. And they were not in bed together, and they were not comfortable with each other. And it was a defensive maneuver by the Senate Finance Committee that actually initiated dual jurisdiction. So very late in the act, the bill provided a Title I and a Title II. This was a grand compromise. It wasn't regarded as ideal. And in point of fact, it's worked surprisingly well. And if I may mention a brief occurrence, as soon as the statute was enacted, we were immediately faced with something known as the Central States Teamsters Pension Plan. The Central States Teamsters Plan was a corrupt operation. It was financing the Las Vegas casinos, you know, buddies of the trustees of the pension plan, of the Central States Pension Plan. And we in the IRS and the labor immediately got together to deal with what we realized was as if it was the only pension plan in the country. We were called up by the Congress. We had a report each week. What are you doing now with the Teamsters? And it became a very remarkable joint effort. It was an early proof that we can make dual jurisdiction work. Of course, it had many problems. It took reorganization plan number 4 to straighten some of them out. I mean, you know, if anybody were looking for an ideal way to administer a law, you wouldn't say, let's put two institutions, two departments, two with their own committees, with their own turf interests, together administering a law. But I mean, that's the reality.
Central States stayed under receivership until relatively recently. I had to go up to the Hill every year and report on what that was going. There was a court-appointed overseer, and it was
absolutely. We removed the trustees. Decades. Immediately. I mean, that became the action, but we had to, the service, to exercise the authority to get rid of the trustees, had to disqualify the Central States Teamsters Plan. And the IRS in Chicago disqualified without talking to us, which was sort of an inside story, but that's another story.
That's okay.
But they
we're good with inside
IRS
stories.
regional offices.
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about it, what the service did, I mean, and that made it possible to move the trustees out and do the salvage action that IRS and labor contrived to deal with the Central States issue very successfully. Changed the investment managers, changed the trustees, did a lot of things, but also disqualified the plan. There were 11,000 Teamster truck companies in America who instantly, upon the loss of qualification of the Central States Plan, lost the tax benefits for the employer sponsors and for the employees because they were now hooked as a multi-employer plan to a disqualified plan. And Meade Whitaker and I sat in a room at one point. Meade later became a judge. He was counsel to the service and said, what are we going to do? It was thrown to us. And we did something called Section 7805B, which is...
But I think that if you take the Central States issue as an example of the degree to which being able to say, well, ERISA is responsible for, or implementation of it saved X, Y, Z, is the Central States Plan, by its own congressional testimony, is now within 10 years of insolvency and is on a track based on withdrawals and other things that they say there's not a way out. Another plan that ERISA dealt with and did a lot with was the creation of the separate mine workers trusts and plans. And by their own congressional testimony, those plans are on the verge of collapse. And the PBGC with the multi-employer program. So there's a lot of pieces of ERISA as you roll forward that you know are both unintended and quotes outcomes. And that even with the government having done yeoman's effort with the Special Investigations Unit that labor created out of the people that were hired from the old Justice Strike Force system. And lots of changes there, and that plan hitting a point where it was overfunded. And now being in this state, it just underlines the dynamics of economies and systems and what's happened in the transportation industry. And I think it reinforces a point that Ann made, which is ERISA has ended up leaving, in spite of people starting off thinking that it would restrict on choice of funding assumptions, on withdrawals, on negotiation of withdrawal liabilities, and all sorts of that flexibility that has the system, the defined benefit system in the current state of, particularly on the multi-side, tremendous difficulties that take you almost back to South Bend, Indiana, and some of the challenges from Studebaker that led to the creation of the statute. Another thing that was in the original statute that I have to believe they, in writing it, had no idea what the eventual effects of it would be. And that were the provisions that changed the fundamental definition, the legal definition for federal law purposes of what is a pension plan. And pre-ERISA, defined benefit plans were the only pension plans. Defined contribution plans had never been defined as pension plans. And during the first years that I was at the Labor Department, is one of the pressures that was constantly coming in the door from what was then the Profit Sharing Council of America and the interest groups representing defined contribution plans were arguments that in essence the definition of ERISA should be modified, and they had never intended to be pension plans. They didn't want to be pension plans, and that was because everybody still thought that if you were a pension plan, it meant you followed the English definition. The only benefit you would ever pay was a monthly check for life. And ultimately, it was that definitional change in ERISA that led Ira Cohen to rule before the end of the 1970s that if a defined benefit plan offered anyone even a partial lump sum distribution, they had to offer it to everyone. And that became the beginning in the oil industry of the move to defined benefit plans offering single sum distributions consistent with the new definition of pensions in ERISA. And I can't believe anybody that was drafting intended that set of outcomes. But you take that and on top of it add the Revenue Act of 1978 containing Section 125 and 401k, and then the dual regulations that after many tomorrows and many soons, Harry did get out of the Treasury Department. And it all played together in ways that I don't think anybody that was at those drafting tables, and I know no one that was in the initial administrative group at the Labor Department that I was part of, had any anticipation that where we are today in this system is where some of the early wording and interpretations of ERISA would ultimately lead us. And I think they have to a very large degree.
Yeah. Nev, let me try to modernize the question in a way and convert it a little bit.
You don't like my questions?
No, it's building on your question. No, I don't like your questions. But I often hear it in terms of, particularly in a time of budget deficits and concern, having Treasury involved as a separate agency means that we can't spend revenue on increasing the retirement readiness of more Americans because it creates deficits, et cetera, et cetera. And I've heard that as an argument for a single agency now, for example, sort of looking at the agency jurisdictional issue and then the role of revenue considerations or tax expenditure considerations in the context of a retirement system, which, I mean, if you accept the general notion that there's a retirement crisis and we need to increase the retirement savings of more Americans, that means the tax expenditures are going to go up significantly. So how do you balance this? I guess I'd be interested in the views of the other panelists. I don't think that necessarily argues for a single agency because I can't believe any agency would be allowed to operate independent of budget and tax expenditure considerations. So I think there's not a necessary linkage there. But that to me has been the expression that I've heard more recently about the multiple agencies, single agency.
I agree. I think the idea of a single agency is theoretically appealing, but I think as a practical matter it'll never happen because it would almost have to end up in Treasury in the service because of the tax implications. And as a former Labor Department person, I think that would really skew the perspective in such a way that you would only be talking about kind of this deficit reduction. And so I don't think as a practical matter people will ever see that. And Brian mentioned, increasingly as the assets under management have grown, and plans, I think one of the unintended consequences is that plans have become such major players in the capital markets and in the economy because of the sheer size. You can no longer expect, I mean, the SEC has always been kind of interested in, like, well, that's a big pot of money. And those people are investors, and they're getting more and more interested. FINRA is issuing guidance. You're seeing these agencies, it's almost inevitable that they're going to be more engaged. And so coordination is difficult. And a lot of it depends on personalities and people of goodwill willing to work together and get it done. And we've always been lucky to have that, I think. But it's not a given. It takes a lot of hard work, I think.
Well, I don't grant Harry that there is a retirement crisis. I don't think things are better than they were in the past. And so I think that crisis, by, again, let's burden the dictionary, crisis is something that is unanticipated, comes suddenly, and is a major negative thing relative to the past. And the irony of the system, as we've seen the definitions in the system change, is that we actually have a system now, due to some of the provisions of ERISA that I think contributed to the demise of defined benefit plans, but have led to capital accumulation for a far larger group of Americans, are the vesting provisions. And other provisions that made defined benefit plans significantly more expensive if you wanted to keep the same benefit formula. And what the data shows us over the 40 years of ERISA is employers, when push came to shove, have not increased their spending on retirement over that 40 years. It's stayed a relatively constant percentage of their compensation spend. And so ERISA said, we want you to spread it to far more people. And many advocates at the time said, therefore employers will spend more money, unions will spend more money. And what has ended up happening through economics is employers said, you want us to give this to more people, fine. That means we will give less to everyone.
Yeah, sure.
And so it has been a move towards far greater equity in the system, far greater equality in the system, but with, in essence, one would have to say an intended consequence at some level, but clearly unintended, of far more people having a contribution to retirement income, even if there are fewer that get, end quotes, an adequate benefit at the end of the day. And that's where I think your comment about the only way to get there is to spend more money, the only way to get everyone to a level of adequacy that a very few ever got in the good old days would have been to spend a lot more money. And nobody's been prepared to do that.
So can I follow up on that? Because I think one of the major challenges, to your point about the focus on deficit reduction, to your point about the fact that we can't spend more money because we're constricted because of those concerns, is the way that we approach the cost of these incentives. Whether we like it or not, the view of retirement incentives are viewed through the prism of tax policy, not retirement policy. So for example, we still use a cash basis scoring system, regardless of the fact that this is a deferral, not a deduction. And I think that has led to tremendous distortion in policymaking in the 40 years.
Well, one bright light rumor is that if Paul Ryan becomes chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, one of the things he is reportedly interested in is dynamic scoring, which would be a big benefit for the retirement systems, where you get to take into account the second order effects. It's extremely controversial, really hard to do, but theoretically could help pull in some of that future tax revenue that is being deferred and outside the budget window in the way we score today. And so it could give a little bit of give.
But it's still within the budget window.
Right.
And even if they move to dynamic scoring, they're stuck in a 5-year window or a 10-year window. And so changing how I calculate the tax expenditure, if the budget process remains the budget process, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Yeah.
And the dynamic scoring is only really, fine, they do a long-term forecast, but they then take the 5-year or the 10-year snapshot, and it still doesn't change things very much. So it may be a whole lot of argument over what at the end of the day, even if they said, fine, we'll do it your way, on calculating a tax expenditure, if they don't change the budget window,
Right.
it doesn't make a darn bit of difference.
For those who may not follow this discussion as well as those who spend a lot of their time on policy,
Or
you
it
know,
means you have not lived inside the Beltway,
Have
you
a
lucky
life.
people.
inside the Beltway.
You
yeah.
lucky people, you have
So-
lives.
What Brian and Dallas are referring to, as I think many of you recognize, is the convention in Congress to estimate the cost of various initiatives or changes in the law based on how much it will cost over the next 10 years or sometimes 5 years. The pension system, of course, as Brian reminds us, tends to generate tax benefits when you contribute and tax revenues when the money comes out as pensions. That tends to be more than 10 years after you contribute in the case of most dollars. So the revenue to the government from the pension being paid out, typically taxed, and therefore generating revenue for the government, isn't shown on a 10-year projection to the same extent as the revenue the government loses from the contributions going in, which are typically deducted or excluded from taxable income. Treasury actually has, although it doesn't get much attention, a present value alternative in the annual budget documents. So instead of just looking at the 10-year cost, it takes, to your point, Brian, tax deferrals, retirement savings in particular, and a few other tax-preferred activities that are really deferrals and not permanent exemptions from tax. And it shows a cost estimate based on an indefinite horizon. So it doesn't stop at 10 years, and then it provides a present value number.
You know, you talked about the paradigm shift that's caused by the move from defined benefit to defined contribution, which has been drastic. I mean, obviously, as Dallas said, pensions were defined benefit. That was all there was. There wasn't any question about that. And you have to look at the whole surrounding terrain. What was happening? Why did the paradigm shift occur? There was a perfect storm. The economy was suffering greatly about the time, and employers, big plans, General Motors plans, became vastly underfunded because of the perfect storm. The markets collapsed, the values of the assets were reduced enormously, and the employer, who's not thinking about 10-year, 5-year dynamic, he's thinking about his own budget problems. And he's facing suddenly these enormous liabilities he's assumed, and their assets aren't there. The market has wiped them out. So and there was that perfect storm time, as it was called, when the paradigm shift began. And you had 401k, and you had defined contribution plans, which today have taken over. It was totally not foreseen that this would happen. So, you know, it hasn't been adequately, even today, taken into account. I mean, where is it going from here? Who knows?
Well, Al, I would ask you whether you think we, in fact, have had a shift from DB plans to defined contribution plans.
Well, that's the consensus.
That's the conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
That's the conventional description of it,
Absolutely.
right? I would suggest, just to be provocative, that we have not. That we've had a shift away from defined benefit plans, to be sure, but it's not to defined contribution plans in a meaningful sense. We've shifted from defined benefit to undefined benefit, undefined contribution plans, in large part. Had we shifted to defined contribution plans, we'd see employers, in many more instances, making defined employer contributions to the plans, not elective deferrals from the employee's salary reduction, and not even matching contributions as much as non-elective profit sharing or money purchase. This is a room where people know what a money purchase plan, I shouldn't say is, I should say was, I guess. Money purchase contributions. We've obviously not seen as many of those as at least we recall in our imaginations between the shift from the defined benefit to the so-called defined contribution. How much do we see by way of profit sharing? Certainly in some areas, you know, some law firms have a 10% or a 7.5% non-elective contribution. Some of the gateway plans in connection with the new comparability regs that ASPA worked on so helpfully, and Brian and others with Treasury, to create more of an employer contribution where there's cross-testing. But by and large, we've gone to a contribution that's up to the employee. It's not defined, and even the employer contribution, to the extent it's a match, is not defined. Where it's going, I would suggest, good news, is back to an effort in a more nuanced way to define, to lead people through automatic enrollment, through automatic step-ups and contributions, through default investments that make at least more sense than what the average individual would do left to their own devices without professional guidance, and to more lifetime income, so that we might be able to put the pensions back in the, what we still call the private pension system.
Well, I mean, I think that your characterization of it is interesting because the economics community, including the two economists that were the primary players at the Labor Department during the drafting of ERISA, Peter Henley and his economics team that worked for the Labor Secretary. And their whole theory was the economist theory of all of the money belongs to the employee. And it's the same way that economists and all of the work of the Feldsteins and others on Social Security assumes that the employer payment is employee money. And they've always looked at all contributions to all plans as only employee money. And so the economics community would disagree with your assessment, other than that the employees may have a little more discretion over how much of their money now goes in. But if you go back again to the late 70s and the beginning of the move to single sum distributions, the difference is the funding difference. It's not the outcome difference. And I dare say that the DB system has largely moved away from an annuity paying system. You have, in free choice plans, you get about 1/3 that choose an annuity, 2/3 that choose single sum distributions. If in the defined contribution system you end up moving towards some annuitization, all of the research would indicate that it'll be a best case would be you get 1/3 of the people to have some annuity income by choice. Our research would indicate that best case probably is closer to 15% that will make that choice, and that may be high. Would I love it if everybody went back to the old system that had my father getting until he died at 94 his monthly check from a DB plan? Yeah, that has appeal. I share none of your optimism or none of your objective assessment, whichever way we characterize it, that is where the future actually holds. I think there'll be lots of product, there'll be lots of people selling it, there'll be lots of people encouraging it, and it is just not what individuals want if they realize they give up control at the same time.
And I think combined with what individuals aren't asking for and employers, I just don't see how you go back to a dynamic DB system that's growing and there's new plans adopted. I mean,
You don't.
the globalization of business has made it very difficult to compete. I think there were two things that really were the death knell, kind of. One, the accounting rule changes when it had to go on the balance sheet. And you now have these pension plans that in many cases are larger than the corporate balance sheet, bouncing around because of the interest rate changes and funding. Was unacceptable to the C-suite. They finally paid attention and said, what's going on? We can't have this. And I think, in retrospect, one of the worst amendments to ERISA was the reversion excise tax. I think then, once you told employers you could never get it back out, they skinnied down what they put in. They put in the bare minimum, and they don't, because they just will not take the risk. And it was very, very, Carrie and I spent, I don't know how many years, trying to figure out how could people take some out and leave enough in. It was very controversial, very complicated. They ended up with a flat, 50% excise tax, and I think those two things together, they'll never come back. I just don't think companies will buy into the promise with those factors.
But can't you imagine, I don't know if this is what's in Mark's mind, sort of a reframing of an individual elective system,
I think
reframing with a pro-retirement tilt, with auto defaults,
Yep.
with more sort of lifetime income options. And it seems to me the current system, the framing, the norms, is really all about sort of a savings account and lump sums and account balances.
Well, that's where I'm pessimistic like Dallas, but
Right.
optimistic if we could stop being nostalgic for the good old days
Right.
and start talking about,
Right.
and I think retirement
Yeah.
income is the big hurdle, but yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we have to get to that kind of a system and
It's not going back.
not going
No,
back.
and we don't have to go back
Right.
to the DB system. It might be good, but we can look beyond the labels, right? And look at the actual attributes and the actual behaviors, which I think the folks in this room generally do. You can have lifetime income in a plan that's called a defined contribution or a 401k or what have you. You can have employer contributions make a difference compared to employee contributions, even though I agree that as a matter of economic analysis, ultimately it comes out of the employee's wages. But that's a long-term, medium to long-term tendency. And we live very much in the short term, in a whole succession of short terms. And so in the shorter term, we've got big differences between the way things are structured, Harry, to your point, the way things are framed. So left to their own devices without props, without behavioral strategies, and a lot of employees will contribute nothing. They won't get around to contributing. We know that if we do things like default them in or use easy enrollment of various kinds or make employer contributions, never mind that ultimately the employee may get less of a pay raise years down the road, the employer contribution got the money into long-term savings. It got the savings to accumulate. And whether it's, you call it an employee contribution by salary reduction or an employer contribution, we're moving the needle. And so, Dallas, I sort of agree with your empirical assessments, but I'm not about trying to predict what is actually going to happen, but trying to shape what's actually going to happen, as I think everyone in this room is actually involved in doing. And I think we can move toward that. Whether we end up getting 15% or 50% in lifetime income, we can shape it. And at the margin, the incremental steps can matter. We get people, instead of looking at whether someone's getting lifetime income or getting a total lump sum, how much of each? They're already getting Social Security lifetime income. Can we help people with partial lump sums and partial annuities reframe the question from which one are you getting to how much of each are you going to get from your retirement program? And there we could make a lot of progress. We could get a lot of people taking some of their benefit, half, a third, a quarter in lifetime income. And that's what we were talking about on Friday, Dallas, when we put out guidance making it clear that 401k plans, and this is an example of what Ann and Al were talking about earlier, the two agencies working together, Treasury, IRS on the one hand, labor on the other hand. We put out joint guidance saying that 401k sponsors could make lifetime income the default, could embed it in a target date fund, and you could do similarly with a managed account, other QDIAs, so that employees might be encouraged to take it by just framing it as the natural component, not all, but part of their benefit.
One example of the importance of framing, and I hate to suggest this, but going back to Dallas's point, you don't hear a lot of people arguing for lump sums out of Social Security. People just don't think about it,
right?
You know, and sort of, you know, God forbid I've just started something, but you know.
The jury will disregard.
Right. Strike that from the record.
Peter Ferrara was ahead of you in 1978 when the first book was published by the Cato Institute, when it was still in San Francisco, advocated the individual account structure for Social Security with full lump sum distributions and the end of annuities. So that debate and discussion has been around for as long as ERISA's been around.
So a big part of ERISA that we haven't talked about yet today is the fact that it was designed to enhance the protection of employee rights in respect to their retirement benefits. And it was also designed to ensure that the assets of the employee were protected. And I think in that regard, I think there's general consensus that it's worked pretty well. But there's a gap, and it's related to what you guys are talking about today, in that this transition away from an annuity form of distribution towards lump sums has created this very large pool of assets in something called an IRA to the tune of, I guess, almost $7 trillion. That's not really covered, if you will, in a normal sense by the agencies in a traditional sense relative to the employer plan. Is that a gap that's going to be increasingly a problem going forward if we are truly moving towards more of a individual account world?
Well, it's clearly, if one looks at the controversy over the Department of Labor's proposed fiduciary reg, and where one of the critical points of controversy is the question of whether or not the ERISA fiduciary provisions would be extended to those managing individual retirement accounts, which has been a bit of a debate at both the SEC and at the Labor Department. I think that's the argument in the preamble of that regulatory process, which is that most of the money in IRAs came out of the qualified system where those protections, all of these protections were there. And shouldn't many of those same types of protections be present as that money moves into the individual retirement account, with the justification being that it is still tax-preferred money, even if it is not still, in quotes, tax-qualified plan money. I don't need to tell anybody in this room how controversial that provision has been, including that ASPA and NAPA have been involved in that debate, I believe. So I think that there's absolutely no question that the ongoing flow of hundreds of billions of dollars per year out of qualified plans into IRAs under current law will continue. And that instead of IRAs at this point only being a bigger pot of money than private defined contribution and private defined benefit assets, they will, on a projected basis, they will become totally dominant of the accumulated pool of assets. I think it leads to one other thing, which is, if you look at ERISA and say, what did they talk about having ERISA do that they didn't include, that probably has had just a tremendous, tremendous impact, it was the decision to not include public pension plans within the framework of ERISA. And if you think about that fiduciary issue, much of the investing of public pension plans in the last 30 years would not have been possible under the ERISA framework, because they quite aggressively chose, in many cases, were choosing to do what in the ERISA context was termed social investing, where not all other things were equal, in order to meet particular goals. And that fiduciary structure not being there, and the funding structure not being there, and the vesting structure not being there, because many public plans still are at 10-year vesting. In fact, the state of Ohio's DB plan recently moved back to 10-year vesting, having gone down to 5. So I think this split between public and private forms of regulation, plus your point, the difference between IRA regulation and qualified plan regulation, those two things alone are going to move more and more of the total asset pool outside of the structure of ERISA, which is a fundamentally different situation that existed 40 years ago or 30 years ago or even 20 years ago.
I think that's true. I agree with all of that, and I think it's an important question for people to debate. But I take exception, Brian, to comments that like IRAs is the Wild West. I mean, people act like because they're not under ERISA, they're not regulated, and that's not the case. I mean, the SEC oversees them, FINRA oversees the advisors to them. It's a very different structure. I'm not arguing it's the same. They're very different types of protections. It's a very disclosure-oriented regime, and I think it's a debate whether there need to be additional rules. But I don't think it's fair to characterize that it's just unregulated. And I do think it's a challenge without the employer nexus there anymore. Imposing the ERISA framework is very difficult. So what do you do in terms of this oversight? One trend we're seeing that's kind of positive is more and more employers are, I think for a long time they wanted to push people out of the plan and roll the money over. And most of the money is rolled over and preserved for retirement. That's the other thing, which is good news. The growth of IRAs means people are preserving their savings for retirement. That's a good news story. But more and more employers are keeping the participants in the plan. And some of that comes from the fee disclosure, which is the unbundling, and they want to be able to get the lower cost fees, the economies of scale. They want to keep the participants in. So it's a very dynamic environment right now, and I think people need to be very thoughtful about it and think about how we want to move forward.
To answer your question, and I get your point.
It was very quotable.
Yeah, it was very quotable. But I think the concern, and I'm not even suggesting that the answer is what the answer is. I'm not suggesting that the answer is an ERISA-based fiduciary standard. I'm not suggesting the answer is a particular form of regulation. I guess the real question is the reality that in that context, ERISA doesn't have a roadmap.
Right.
Where in the case of IRAs, although your point is well taken with respect to SEC-regulated investments, there's a sizable pool of IRA assets that are not in SEC-regulated investments that really don't have the FINRA/SEC protections that you're referring to. And so, that to me, the absence of a consistent set of rules, not suggesting what those rules are, is the gap that, given the trend in terms of where the asset flows are, is concerning.
Well, and I think that it also, Mark's comments, I think Ann's comments, both heavily relate to the large plan universe. And when you start moving into the plan universe below 1,000 and particularly below 500, is you see much lower rates of the kind of plan design approaches you're describing.
Right.
And you see far less of the I want to keep the assets in the plan. because of, I mean, it's a whole different set of record-keeping issues and tracking people and size of account balances and various other things. As a very small employer, I know that even though we have had not that many employees over the last 36 years, is we still have managed to find the Social Security Administration lose track of some of them where we kept money. And we have, for some people that are still in their 40s, account balances that we've put into orphan IRAs under the regulations, because even, as I say, Social Security can't tell us if they're alive, dead, or where they live. Mm-hmm. And I think that for the smaller enterprises, but even big companies, that is an issue relative to how much of that money you want to keep in the employer system as opposed to the attractiveness of shifting it to IRAs and making it somebody else's tracking issue.
Mm-hmm. And employees have a vote here, and we see more and more employees will, a lot of them will leave the money in the plan initially, and again, this is maybe in the larger end,
but it's
middle
large
to large.
End.
But after
right.
3 years, if they have a lump sum available, a lot of them will roll it out because they want to consolidate their assets. They've got a new employer. There are lots of reasons that the employee gets to say what
I just
they
think
want
it's timing issues and
Yeah.
employer size issues
Yeah.
and timing issues that play into it.
Well, just to take it down to a practical point, as many of you know, a few months ago, Treasury issued guidance designed to make it easier to keep money in the employer plan system when people, as you say, Ann, do move to a new employer, as so often happens, so that the new employer can accept rollovers from the former employer's plan with greater ease. Instead of having to check and see whether the former plan was tax qualified by getting a certification from the former plan sponsor or by getting a copy of an IRS favorable determination letter on the former plan, the incoming plan, the plan receiving the rollover, if they want to receive it, can just go online and look up the 5500 of the sending plan. And if it doesn't say, as virtually always be the case, it doesn't say it's not intended to be qualified, then it is intended to be qualified, and it takes just a couple of minutes without paperwork having to go back and forth, often in the hands of an employee who doesn't really have time or patience to deal with all that. So to the extent we can make rollovers easier, we can make consolidation easier in not only an IRA, but in the current employer's plan. And that seems like it's a good thing, and certainly would welcome people's thoughts and ideas here about how to further consolidate, encourage consolidation, encourage tracking of the benefits. And certainly at Treasury, we've been thinking about ways to make it easier to do that. So as a small employer, you don't have to just look at whether Social Security has the records, but you have other ways to help people consolidate, keep track of everything they've got, all their tax qualified retirement accounts, DB, DC, IRA, in one place, a kind of universal registry, if you will, or other way to either physically consolidate in one pool or just keep track of it, consolidate it in terms of your mental accounting. I've got the list of my 5 401k, DB, IRA pots of money. I know exactly where they are. I have that list in front of me. So I can access it and I can physically consolidate whenever I want. So ideas on how to get there more effectively, it's in a sense surprising that our system isn't yet there. And I think in the next few years we will find a way to do that.
Another, I think, aspect of your question, and I think it supports where you were going, is that I think as the system is moving from non-elective employer contributions, whether it be DB or DC, to more individual decision-making around contributions, many employers have felt sort of responsible, wanting to help the employees on their decisions through education and guidance or setting out a set of good options in terms of their annuity bid platforms, their IRAs. And I think there is, under current law, an uncertainty about whether that helpful guidance itself makes the IRA an employer plan, because there's not open discretion. There's a steering, and it's a helpful steering, trying to be helpful, but it may sort of trigger a set of risks and liabilities that I know have caused some employers to say, well, we want to be helpful, but we're afraid of that risk because the steering could be viewed as causing those IRAs to be employer maintained under the DOL regs. And so that's another reason I think not having this difference and having a similar set of rules, so you don't have this cliff or this line that people can play around or stop just short of. So that's not there.
So if I'm going to try to come up with the 5 worst things about ERISA.
Before you go to IRA, you know, it's incredible how the IRA monster has grown. I mean, I don't call it a monster as a pejorative. I mean, it's just big as big. It's the gorilla in the room. It didn't exist. First of all, you mentioned Ira Cohn. Ira Cohn was one of the drafters that the IRS sent over, and then I inherited him. He became my technical advisor. But the IRA is named after Ira Cohn. It was a tribute to Ira by his buddies before ERISA was enacted.
Al, I was just going to ask you that, if you could confirm, here we are, you know, with 1,000 people on the record. This is a rumor that's always been out there.
Urban legend.
An urban legend, as Brian puts it. So can you put a little more color on that? Just sort of tell us what you remember and confirm that it really was named after Ira Cohn?
Well, I've told you everything I know.
I think that's a yes.
I think that's a yes.
Oh, no question.
Anything
about
on
it.
D.B. Cooper?
Actually, I will say Ira. Yeah, right. Ira was a very bright fellow. He was like a freewheeling. He was his own loose cannon, and then he got into the IRS back again, and he became my technical advisor. And I must say, I put him under some constraints. I was going to ask, before you go to your next subject, how does cash balance fit into this? I mean, it's somewhere between the two. Employers have gravitated towards it as a defined benefit type of defined contribution plan. It has appeal, and it's growing in its appeal. One might have thought it would go away, but it hasn't. What do you think about that? I mean, is it the future, or is it here, or what?
Well, there are many companies that had gone from traditional DB to cash balance that have now terminated both the traditional DB or hard frozen, then hard frozen, in some cases terminated and closed out their cash balance plan and have moved totally to defined contribution. At the very, very small end of the market, where the activity is principally tax-driven tax advice, then there is some creation of some new smaller cash balance plans. I would argue is largely tax motivated because of the funding differentials between what you can do with a DB or in a combined plan combination. But that's legal and it's flexible, but I think that it is about, again, capital accumulation, because those plans generally end up paying single sum distributions. They don't generally pay life income at the end of the stream, similar to the variable annuity that never pays an annuity.
Never.
Mark and I were just talking, there's another urban legend that's apparently out there. It has to do with another recent product that's out there called the Myra. Mark, the rumor is that's been named after you in some way. Is that true?
I can confirm that also, that it's not true. I think the theory you're referring to is that the my in my RA was based on the first letter of my first name and the last letter of my last name. It's not true at all. And
It's a good way to start the
Ira
rumor.
Cohen and I have a lot in common, but not that. No.
Well, there's another sort of urban legend issue, and maybe the panel can weigh in on it. I mean, Ann and I were talking about this yesterday. I think we counted 25 to 30 sort of fathers or mothers of 401k plans. It's sort of the most claimed plan design around. So any views on that? I mean,
I'm not one of them.
Who really
It's me, actually.
Who really came up with the design?
High school project.
I don't really know. I will say this. One of the strongest defenses of it is by Professor Zielinski, who's written a very interesting book on this, the ownership society. And he contends that the defined contribution has moved into a position that it's not going to abandon,
Right.
and that it's just going to grow. But that's his thesis.
I would just add, in connection with that background, there's a wonderful book by my former law partner and friend, the late Eddie Cohen, who was a professor of tax at UVA and a partner at Covington and Burling. And Eddie recites in that book about, I'd say, 7 or 8 pages worth of the early history of the 401k when it was not a salary reduction. Ted Benna's often credited for the salary reduction innovation there. Johnson & Johnson, I think, was involved in that. But
Johnson & Johnson,
before that,
the corporation was doing it prior to that, along with about
Right.
12 corporations. There's also
right.
a
And so before
major,
that,
there's a major tax notes piece that the Cohen book actually references.
okay.
That's about a 30-page rendition of the early
Oh, great.
history.
Well, actually, I'd
The
like to
Dead
read
Sea
that too.
Scrolls of 401k.
So, yeah, the book, the Ed Cohen book is called
There
Deep
are
in
many fathers.
the Many Fathers. It's called Deep in the Heart of Taxes. Eddie was a terrific guy, humorist, and he talks about how originally some of the money setter banks in New York had started with this bonus, which the executives wanted to defer. And Dallas, this resonates a little bit with the story that you were telling earlier about the origins of the lump sum and the DB, where I think it was a CEO who wanted his annuity in the form of a lump sum, and that led to the Ira Cohen decision, and the rest is history. Well, in the case of the 401k, it was the bonuses. Some of the executives wanted them, and they wanted them deferred, tax deferred. And so it led to a kind of bonus-based tax deferral elected by the employee at the administrative level. It wasn't legislation at all. This is before the 78 Act. It was earlier in at least in the 70s. And IRS was approached to rule on whether it was okay. And they actually said that it could be as long as you met certain conditions. And they worked out the first non-discrimination test, sort of pre-ADP, at the administrative level. Danny Halpern was involved. He was at Treasury
TLC.
in the 70s, and
I was
Harry...
I was just
Yeah.
going to say, in 70, what you're talking about was pre-74, because
Right.
ERISA itself has a moratorium on something called cash or deferred arrangements.
Cash or deferred
And
arrangements.
they talked about
CODAs.
bonus versions and salary reduction in the moratorium,
Right.
in the statute.
Right.
Two large companies.
So that was in 74.
And
Yeah.
the two large companies that had those were Kodak and Xerox, both headquartered in Rochester, New York at the time.
Yeah.
And their local congressman was Barbara Conaway, who was the ranking Republican on the Ways and Means Committee. And it was Conaway's staff that drafted the 401k language. There's a former, I'm blanking on the name, but there is a lawyer who was at the Joint Tax Committee who claims to be the father of having drafted the 401k
certainly don't mean Larry
provision.
Woodworth.
No.
Who was the chair of it?
East Stanger? Richard Stanger?
Stanger.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Stanger claims to have been the father of the 401k before Ted Benna had his vision.
And I think Ivins, Phillips, and Barker with Carol Savage.
And Carol
they
Savage
did a lot of work
and
with
others.
those companies that you're talking about.
They were the firm doing the lobbying for them.
Dan Halpin is still at Harvard, is the last I knew teaching.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And doing a terrific job. Has contributed a great deal to our
He's
field.
outstanding and always was.
Yep.
Feels a little bit like the Stewart video yesterday.
I have to tell you about Eddie Cohn. Eddie Cohn was very diminutive, was a small man with a big Southern accent, and he doesn't look like he comes out of the South. I remember the first time I saw Eddie Cohn, if I may say so, at a PLI program on the cases known as Church and Spiegel. I guess the lawyers here remember Church and Spiegel. They were two Supreme Court decisions having to do in the estate area. Very controversial decisions. And PLI, Practicing Law Institute, had a seminar in New York City on the Church and Spiegel case, and a panel twice the size of this. And everybody were these experts, and they were talking about it and confusing the issue. The audience couldn't follow it. Finally, the chairman, in a moment of brilliance, turns to Eddie Cohn, who'd been sitting there very quietly at the end of the table, almost, very small guy. He practically couldn't see him over the table. He said, Eddie, would you straighten us out in 2 minutes? And this Southern fella starts talking in 2 minutes. He has literally straightened out the whole issue. Eddie Cohn was one of the giants, despite his diminutive size.
Absolutely.
All right, 5 best things about ERISA, 5 worst things about ERISA. We'll do lightning round, all right? So what and why? Go. Harry.
Lightning round.
Can I call a friend? I'd like to call a friend.
Can I get back to you?
I would say the ERISA preemption setting up a federal framework that went just beyond the tax framework into the labor area. Even though the particular provisions of that framework may have been changed, it's that flexibility also within that framework, which I think was a real positive. I think that's one of the big positives.
Well, I think funding is another big positive. Funding standards, and I think fiduciary standards are in the top 3 that I identify. And I think, unintendedly, I now include the PBGC within the top 5 in the guarantee structure, given what the history has ended up being.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nevin, I'd say on the negative side of the ledger, and this isn't necessarily a fault of ERISA, but maybe the greatest single disappointment in the 40 years since it was enacted, I would suggest, is lack of coverage. That we still have tens of millions of American working families who have no access to an effective employer plan. They can save in IRAs, but they don't save in IRAs with any material frequency. It's a single-digit percentage of eligible people who actually do save in IRAs. So the fact that we have such a large portion of our population, not to debate over what the exact percentage is, which I don't think is a particularly, it's something we need to do, and
It's
Dallas,
less than 100%.
Dallas and his folks do a great job, but whether it's a third of the population or a little more or a little less who are not eligible, and we know it's a larger percentage who are not taking advantage
It's too many.
of it. It's
It is
many,
too
too many, and to the extent we can continue to work, as many of us here have been doing, to expand coverage and to make it more close to universal,
I think that's
I
right,
think
but
we can correct that.
There's always going to be, I think, a gap of the population that has a low attachment to the workforce or very low wage
Yep.
jobs, and that's why I think Social Security is so important. We have to think of the
Yep.
two together.
Well, and
Yep.
that's
And it is the safety net, and it has a very high replacement ratio for those people, and
Right.
it's really important to that we think of
But
the
there's
two
still
systems together.
there's still 20 million people making between 30
Oh, I'm
and
not saying that's-
100,000
we don't- it's
that
not a
don't have
problem.
access to a plan. I mean,
Right.
No,
That's a
there's
big
there
gap.
is
and
room
the
for growth.
right, and the debates about this, I think, you know, one needs to start, at least in my view, with a recognition that the employer plan system has done great things. You know, and that the concerns about the coverage gap, as you say, Ann, it makes Social Security all the more important, but we know Social Security isn't enough for for so many American families without being supplemented. You know, we can start with the proposition that the employer-sponsored system has done great things and continues to deliver meaningful benefits to tens of millions of middle-income families and some lower-income families too. But that we need to do more and cover those tens of millions who are not in the system.
Nevin, I guess I would disagree with Mark only in this. I agree that that's a current major policy issue. I don't view ERISA as having been aiming at that.
Yeah,
I think of ERISA as
agree.
having been aimed at making the promises that were made then, the plans that were in existence then, real. And sort of from that perspective, I wouldn't include the coverage as much then. I would say it's the public plans that Dallas mentioned, multi-employer plans, retiree health, things that were out there where employers were making commitments that were not in fact real in terms of the employees actually getting the benefits that they thought they might be getting.
Mm-hmm. You know, you just mentioned health. Surprisingly, that's the first time that word has come up in this discussion. We have to realize the health benefit is integral to the well-being, retirement security as the pension benefit. ERISA completely ignored the health benefit. Not completely, it preempted health care and provided no rules for it. So there was this enormous gap for a long time. What are the rules? I mean, it's preempted, but what is it? What governs it? Didn't know. ACA came along. We now have a big gorilla in the room. It's feeding at the same trough. There's only so much money in the society, and the health care is going to take an increasingly big chunk of it. So where does it go? At some point, I think there ought to be a commission or something that deals with this separation of two worlds, side by side, each really providing for the security, well-being, and health of the employee.
Yeah, Al, I'm glad you brought that up because that is, I think it's absolutely true that it's huge. And that's why those of us who are in government now are spending half our time on each, if not more on health.
I would think so.
And the importance of thinking broadly about how the health and the retirement, and as Dallas often points out, the long-term care risks, which are sort of part of that health care picture.
That's the worst part,
figure together in managing the risks of the financial risks in retirement, be it long-term care, health, inflation, investment, counterparty, or in particular longevity risk. You know, we are thinking of those in an integrated way.
How could you not?
Yeah.
Now, but I think another negative is the degree to which ERISA and implementation essentially purposefully divided the historical integration of employer and individual retirement planning from Social Security by what ended up being discouragement of integrated plan designs. The reality, to Mark's point, is as long as Social Security's been there with private system, you've got about 36% of retirees that have their only income source is Social Security, and to the reality of health care, long-term care, and other things. Regrettably, that's a population segment that does not have any money to really spend. Plus, we now have 51 million Americans on food stamps. Food stamps have a $2,000 means test attached to them. And balances in 401k plans and IRAs will disqualify you from food stamps. And there are multiple other social welfare programs at the federal, state, and local level that move you essentially to to really, I would argue, need to go back to looking at all of these pieces, how they do work together and need to work together. And that becoming, Brian, the method to say, here's how many people don't have supplementation, that need supplementation, and frankly can afford to have supplementation without giving up so much in the way of a Medicaid benefit or a food stamp benefit or something that is the difference between living and not living.
Sure.
And much of the debate over coverage and much of the active action since ERISA, where it encouraged us to say, sort of ignore that Social Security exists, do this private stuff over here, but certainly don't do a defined contribution step rate integrated formula. Don't integrate DB plans, which the academic community and the reformers were very critical of pre-ERISA and even post-ERISA, continued to be critical of, pushing the IRS to continuously move towards regulations that made it less and less generous to integrate.
Yeah.
And I think there's a point at which, given your issue, there's only so much money. There's only so much individual money, there's only so much corporate money, union money, there's only so much government money and capacity.
Of course.
And with that total capacity, we are not going to be in a position to expand every one of these components.
No question. That's why they have to be viewed with an integrated
And so we need
perspective.
to become more integrated in it.
Yeah.
I'm just, even though this came a little after ERISA, I'm just going to say top-heavy rules. Come on, really?
Right.
I mean, really discourage small plan coverage, don't really accomplish much other than the compliant, really that's sort of in the soup of focusing too much on chasing what I call the boogeyman, the idea that someone is taking advantage of the system, an overemphasis that occurred for a long time that I think unfortunately hindered a lot of coverage.
I hadn't narrowed it to top heavy, but the number 5 on my worst list, because I did think through best and worst, was the degree to which ERISA initially and as amended basically totally divorced the interest of decision makers in large institutions and small institutions
From the qualified plan.
from the qualified plan marketplace, and has progressively moved more and more and more of their interest to non-qualified by necessity. And as that system has moved to where this total divide between, in essence, the economic dynamics of this for the decision-making few relative to the mass is what I think that has ended up being a dramatic driver of the decline of DB plans. I think it's been a dramatic driver.
On Brian's point, not just top heavy, but I think it's also the tendency to layer on the non-discrimination rules and things like that, where every time there's a problem, we come in with a new rule, we don't ever clean it out. So it's the administrative complexity and the challenge of setting up a plan for a small company when the owner-employee doesn't see much personal benefit, it really is a hindrance. And
Absolutely.
it's a tough thing to do because every one of those rules, there's a reason and a story behind it and an abuse. But boy, cumulatively, it is really challenging.
I must make one comment before you turn the lights out on
All right.
this. You asked for an inside story. When dual jurisdiction came in, we in the service were responsive to the labor committees as well as the tax committees. The Congress is the Congress. And I remember being called to a hearing conducted by John Dent, who was then the chairman of the Labor Committee, and John Erlenbowen, who was the minority leader of the Labor Party. So those two guys were up on the panel, and I was the only witness. And at one point, Dent, who was not a shy congressman, leans over at the table, and he points to me, and he says, "Why did you do this, Mr. Lurie?" John Erlenbowen whispers to him, it was a stage whisper, "We did that, Mr. Chairman."
And on that note,
I loved John Erlenborn for the rest of his life.
Join me in thanking our panel for a great discussion.
All right, guys, don't forget about tonight's party. We're going to rock the 80s, except without Tefra, Defra, and Rhea. So we'll see you tonight. Thanks so much to our speakers. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Right.